Back to the scripting for After Effects tutorial. This is part 2, and in this tutorial we're going to be going through scripting for After Effects specifically. In the last tutorial we went over some basic JavaScript concepts that you need to start scripting. But in this tutorial we're going to get into all of the After Effects specific parts of scripting so that we can actually create a script that runs and performs a task within After Effects. So here you can see I have just a very simple project set up, a bunch of solids, and one of our solids has some markers on it. We have 7 markers here. And the script that we're going to create is going to take the layer with the markers and it's going to change the start time of 7 different layers, just because we have 7 different markers here, to the start time of those markers. So I'm just going to go through by hand what we want our script to do. So let's start with layer 1. Layer 1 is already lined up with marker 1. Let's go to marker 2, align layer 2, go to marker 3, align layer 3, and you get the point. So it's just going to go through and move all of these layers. Now, 7 markers, 7 layers may not be something that is worth writing a script for, but if you have a layer that has 100 markers, 200 markers, and 200 layers, it's going to take some time to go through each one of those markers and layers and align them. So this script is going to make it happen instantly. So let's get started with our script. So we're going to open up our script editor, and we're going to start out by creating some variables. And these variables are going to hold After Effects components. The first thing we want to do is set a variable equal to the composition that we're in. So to do that, we're going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call it the comp. And I'm going to set that equal to the active composition. Now, compositions and anything that appears up in this project panel in scripts is considered to be an item. So this right here is a composition item. This is a folder item. This is an AV layer item, and so on. So everything that appears up here is considered to be an item. So in order to find the composition that we're in, we're going to look for the active item. So to start out, we have to type in app.project, and this specifies our current application and our current project, and then we're going to type active item, and make sure you're aware of the case there. So active lowercase, item uppercase, and we can end this with our semicolon. So right now this will create a variable which contains the current active composition. Now real quick, one thing I didn't mention in the previous tutorial that is actually a very important part of coding is comments. And what comments allow you to do is write notes about what you're scripting, about what needs to happen, different things, can be anything. And it just helps you keep organized and make sure you know what's going on and what you were thinking at the time. So I'm going to be using comments throughout this tutorial to kind of explain what's happening in each line, and then you'll be able to download this script and you'll be able to see all the comments so that you can go through it and better understand what's going on. So to write a comment, there's a couple ways to do it. One is to put 2 forward slashes, and then anything after that is a comment. And you can see it shows up as green, which basically just means it's not being affected, it's not being read by the script. All of this stuff is ignored. The second way to write a comment, and I'll show you the problem first, is let's say you have a very long comment. Oops. And so it gets to a point where it's too long to be on one line, so you want it to be on the next line. Well, when you start a new line, it's no longer a comment. So there's a couple ways to fix that. Either each line needs to start with those double forward slashes, or you can create what's called a multi-line comment. And to do that, you're going to type a forward slash and then an asterisk. And then everything you type is a comment until you end the comment. So we start it with a forward slash and then an asterisk. We end it with an asterisk and then a forward slash. And now we're back to normal coding. So there's those 2 types of comments. There's the single line and the multi-line. And here I'm just going to put a single line comment. And notice that you can put those comments on the same line as script as long as it comes after them. And so the first part of this line will be run, but the part after the comment won't be. It wouldn't work the other way around, obviously, because if there's a comment before, everything following that becomes a comment. So this line is going to set a variable. Alright, so now we have the active composition. Next thing we want to do is get the selected layer, which is going to be our layer that has the markers. So, how do we do this? Well, let's create a new variable, and we're going to call it the layer. And we're going to set this equal to the selected layer. Now, you could go through and type this stuff again. However, since we have this variable, instead of having to type the app, project, active item, we can just type the comp. Now there's a couple different ways to specify which layer you want. One way is to type .layer, and then in parentheses we can put the layer's index, and the layer index is this number right in this column. Or, since we don't necessarily know which one of the layers is going to have the markers, we're going to rely that the user has the marked layer selected. So what we're going to do is find the selected layer. So the comp.selected layers. Now notice the S here, this is selected layers, because this returns all the layers that are selected in an array. Now what makes this a little bit tricky is that we're only looking for one layer, but even when one layer is selected, this still returns an array. And if you remember, the first element in an array has an index of 0. So what we want to do is take the selected layer from the comp and return the first element in that array. So what we've done here is we're returning the selected layer, only one layer, which is the first item in the selected layers array. So let's make a comment for this. Okay, now using this layer, which has the markers on it, we're going to find out how many markers this layer has. So we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call it num markers. So how do we get the number of markers? Well, let's start out with the layer. So we're first specifying which layer we're talking about, and because it's been stored in this variable, we can now just use the variable itself. The layer.marker, and this will get us into the marker attributes. Now there are different ways to specify this marker property. You can also type the layer.property, and then in quotes inside parentheses you can type marker. And there are probably a couple other ways, but the way I like to do it is just by typing marker, all lowercase, and I think that's the simplest way. Okay, so the layer.marker.num keys. Then we can end the line with a semicolon. So what this is saying is it's saying in the layer, under the marker properties, how many keys are there? And basically what it's saying is how many markers are on this layer. So now this variable contains a number telling us how many markers there are. Okay, so now we have the three variables that we need to create our script. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a for loop that loops for each marker and repositions the start time of each layer. So let's start out by creating our for loop. So for, opening and closing parentheses, and inside, remember, there's 3 parameters. First we have to create our variable, and I'm just going to say I is equal to 1. And the reason I'm starting with 1 is because the first layer index is 1, not 0. So I is equal to 1, semicolon. We want to do this as long as I is less than or equal to num markers. So basically this is going to run through, and since we have 7 markers, when it's equal to 7, it's still going to run, but once it's equal to 8, it's no longer less than or equal to, so it's going to end. And then our incrementer I++. So inside this loop we only need a single line of code. So what this part of the code needs to do is set the time of each layer to the marker's time. So to do that, we're going to start out by saying the comp, because we're no longer talking just about this layer. We're talking about different layers in the composition. So we're going to start out with the comp dot layer, and in parentheses this is where we specify the layer's index. Now this is constantly changing, so what we do is just put I inside. So it's going to the first time through the loop, it's going to have, we're going to go to layer 1, second time through layer 2, and so on. And what we're affecting in this layer is the layer's start time. So start time, and we want to set this equal to the time of the first marker. So now we're talking about the layer, because the layer is what contains these markers. Then I'm going to type dot marker, and then we're going to type key time. Now to get the particular marker we're talking about, open and closing parentheses, and once again we're going to put I. So when we get the first layer, we're also going to be getting the first marker. Second time through, second layer, second marker. And if we run this, making sure we have our markered layer selected, and we go into After Effects, you can see what happened. All of our layers have been moved. Now one thing you should notice is that if I undo this, everything is undone one at a time. So the script, although it all happens instantly, really it's going through and it's doing each step one at a time, just as you would, just at a much quicker pace. So really, our script is functioning and complete, but there's a lot more we can add to this to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So let's say the first layer of the composition is not the layer you wanted to start moving. Let's say you wanted the third layer to be with marker 1, the fourth layer to be with marker 2, so you wanted to start our script from the third layer. Well, how do you do that? Well, we could go into our script and add 2 here, and this would make it so our first marker is matched up with our third layer, and if we run through this, making sure we have the correct layer selected, you can see now it starts from our third layer. But having to go into our script and change this every time might not be something you want to do. So what we're going to do is create a prompt that asks the user what layer they want to start with. So create a new variable, call it start layer. And we're going to set this equal to the prompt, and I'm going to say first layer to be affected. And just for an example, layer 1. Okay, so now when we run this in After Effects, we get prompted for which layer we want to start with. So we would type 3, the script would run, and obviously nothing's happened correctly yet because we haven't used the data we just collected. But that's how it's going to start. Okay, so now that we've collected this data from our user, we need to implement it into our loop. Now, you couldn't just do this because then the layer would be the same each time. So what we need to do is combine it with our changing variable. Now the problem here is that let's say the user put in 2 as the start layer. Well, if the start layer is equal to 2 and the variable is equal to 1, then the first layer that's going to be moved is not layer 2 but layer 3. So to fix this, we need to subtract 1 from whatever the user puts in, and that'll fix our problem. And just to keep this from being a little bit too much on one line, I'm going to set this equal to a new variable called layer index, and then we can put layer index into this loop. So before we run this, let's just make some comments. Okay, so let's run this and let's see what happens. Have our layer selected, run, ask us for a layer, we'll say 3. And you can see it worked exactly as we expected. Starting with layer 3, it went down the line. And if we undo this and run it again, let's say we start with layer 2. You can see it now started with layer 2 and went down the line. And each consecutive layer is moved to the next marker. Okay, so let's undo this. And you can see that every time we're running the script, we have to undo it one layer at a time. And if you had 100 markers or 200 markers or 1,000 markers and you made a mistake, you would have to undo it 1,000 times. But there's a way to get around that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create what's called an undo group. So to create an undo group, you type app.begin undo group, and in parentheses we're going to give it a name. And I'm just going to use layers to markers. And after we begin our undo group, we have to end our undo group. And we want to end it after our script has been run. So down under the for loop, we're going to type in app.end undo group, parentheses, semicolon, and nothing needs to be put here. So here we are starting our undo group, and here we are ending our undo group. And now if we run this, we'll just keep it at 1. Everything's happened just the same, but if we go up to edit, you can see it now says undo layers to markers, and if we hit undo or Control Z, you can see it undoes everything at once. And that can save you a lot of time when you're writing your scripts. So keep that in mind. This can be very useful. And also, if you're writing scripts for other people to use, that's definitely something that'll make it look more professional and more user-friendly. Now, although right now we have a working script, it's complete as far as what we were trying to get it to do. But we are assuming when we run this script that the proper layer is selected, that a composition is open and selected, that the layer selected has markers. We're assuming a lot of different things. And if I'm selected, like let's say over here, and I run this script, well, we get an error back because it's asking for something that doesn't exist. So what we would want to do now is do some error checking. We would want to check to make sure that a composition is selected. We want to check to make sure that a layer is selected. We want to make sure that the layer that's selected has markers, and many other things. Now, there are a little bit too many checks to do for me to go through each one in this tutorial, but I'm just going to go through a couple just to show you some simple ways of doing these checks. Now, the way I want to do this is to run these checks in if statements, and if everything checks out, we want to run the script. And instead of having this inside of all this error checking, I'm going to make it into a function. So if you remember in the last tutorial, I told you it was possible to create your own functions other than the standard ones like prompt and alert and those. So to create a function, what we're going to do is start out by typing function. You can see it turns blue because it's recognized by JavaScript. And here we're going to type the name of our function. And I'm just going to type in layers to markers, opening and closing parentheses, and in here is where you would put your own parameters. So if you're using parameters in your function, this is where you would initialize them, but we don't have any. So just like a for loop or an if statement, we now have our opening curly brace, and at the end we have our closing curly brace. And now we've created a function. And every time we run this function, it's going to run everything that's inside. Now, one thing you should know is that right now, if we ran this script, it asks us just as usual, but nothing happens. And the reason for that is that here we are only declaring the function, we are not running the function. In order to run the function, you have to call it. So just like we call the prompt function, we need to call our function. And even if you don't have any parameters, you still have to put the opening and closing parentheses, otherwise it doesn't recognize this as a function. So by saying this, it's saying run this function. And now if we do it, you can see our function has been run. So that's how you declare a function and run it. So now we can get into that error checking, and once it's passed all the tests, we just call the function. So we need to do this as we're declaring these variables. So we're going to start out with our first variable, the comp. Now let's see what is contained in the comp if we get an error. So we're going to alert the comp. And I'm just going to comment out these lines because we're just focusing on this first part. So let's select something that's not what we want, and we'll run the script, and it's going to alert null. And that's because there's no item selected. So this variable was set to nothing. So the first check we're going to do is we're going to say if the comp is equal to null, then we want to alert to the user you must have an active composition to run this script. So you could write something like this, and that would tell the user, yes, you need to have a composition active in order to run the script. However, if they don't have a composition active, that also means they don't have a layer active. So instead of writing this alert, I'm actually going to write, you must have a layer with markers. You must have a layer with markers selected. And even though that's not what caused the error, the error is caused by not having a composition selected, when the user selects a layer with markers, a composition will become active. So this is basically making the user do something that solves this, but also helps them from creating future errors. So if the comp variable is equal to null, we're going to alert the user that they need to have a layer selected. Otherwise, we're going to go on to our next check. So let's test this out. Right now we have something selected, and I run it, and nothing happens. Okay. Now let's select our project window, so we don't have a layer active, and we run it, and now we get that error. You must have a layer, and I spelled that wrong, with markers selected. So let's change this. Alright, so now that actually makes sense, let's move on. Alright, so now we know whether or not there is an item selected. However, like I said earlier, there are different types of items. So, the item that's selected might not necessarily be a composition item. For instance, if we have this solid selected, it's not going to be a comp item. And there, it will pass this test, but it won't be what we're looking for. So we need to do a second test to make sure that the selected layer is a comp item. Now, instead of doing another if statement, I'm actually going to write another line in the same if statement. And to do that, I'm going to separate the two statements with an OR operator. And the OR operator is two vertical lines, and that is shift backslash, and on most keyboards that's right above the enter key. And so this operator means OR. So we're going to say if the comp is null or the composition is not an instance of comp item, then we're going to alert this. Otherwise, we'll run it. So basically, we're doing a second check to make sure that the item selected is, in fact, a composition item. So, the comp instance of, all lowercase, and you can see it turns blue. So we're saying, is the comp item an instance of comp item? And one thing to notice here is that both comp and item are uppercase. Okay, so right now this is checking to see if the comp item is an instance of comp item. If this is true, it will return true. If it's not an instance of, it's going to return false. And the problem is that if it returns false, we're going to go to the second part. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap this in parentheses, and we're going to say, is this equal to false? Okay, so now we have if the comp is null or it's not equal to, and we're getting not equal to from saying if this returns false. So if it's false, it's not equal to a comp item. So if it's false, we want to alert it also. So if the composition is null or it's not equal to a comp item, we're going to alert the user. So let's test this out. We're going to go back in here. We'll select nothing first, and we'll run it. And you can see you must have a layer with marker selected. Then, like I did before, I'm going to select the black solid, which is also an item, and we'll run this. And we can see we get our arrow. And now, just to make sure it will work with the composition, we'll run it one more time with the composition selected, and you can see nothing happens. So we passed our test. It got through. So now we did two checks. We made sure that an item is selected, and we made sure that the item that's selected is a composition item. So now let's do another check, and this time we're going to be using our next variable. So we'll first set that variable, and let me go back up here and comment this real quick. Okay, so now that we have something in the composition for sure, we can then use this variable down here knowing that it contains the proper information. So now we have the layer equals selected layers 0. Now if there aren't any layers selected, then this variable, like the composition, is going to be set to null. So we can use the exact same if statement from before, replacing it with the layer. So the layer, if the layer equals null, then we're going to alert, and we use the same alert. You must have a layer with markers selected. Okay, so that's all we need for the layer. Now we're going to do one more for our last variable. And we'll paste it up here, get rid of the comment. Okay, so once it passed the test that we do have a layer selected, we're going to check to see if this layer has markers. So let's see what happens when we alert the number of markers for a layer that does not have any markers on it. So we'll select one of these layers, no markers, and we'll run this, and we get 0. And then if we select a layer that does have markers and run this, we get 7. So all we have to do is do a simple if statement to see if this variable equals something greater than 0. So if num markers, and we can just say if num markers is equal to 0, so if there are no markers, then we're going to alert once more, you must have a layer with markers selected. Otherwise, we can prompt the user for that starting layer. So once it's passed all these previous tests, we're ready to ask the user for some information. Now, you might think that once we ask it, then we can run that function. However, let's see what happens. Let's see what happens if we run this, and everything's working correctly because we have the right stuff selected. But let's say the user typed in some letters instead of numbers. Well, now we get an error because null is not an object because it tried to add numbers with letters, and so it didn't work out. So the last check that I'm going to show you how to do is how to make sure that a number was put in and not letters, not text. So let's write an if statement. And we're going to use a function that's called ParseInt. And what ParseInt does is it's going to take any string and convert it to a number. So if we take the ParseInt of our start layer, and actually let me take this out of an if statement, and we're going to alert this at first just so we can see what's going on. So alert ParseInt of our start layer, and we'll run this. So it asks for a number, we'll say 10, and it alerts 10 back to us. But let's run it again, and this time I'm going to type something. And when we alert this, it comes back as NaN, which stands for not a number. So anytime we type something that's not a number, even if it contains numbers and then letters, it'll be fine because there are some numbers to be converted in there. But if it's just letters, we're going to get that NaN. So what we can do is there's actually a function called isNaN that allows us to check if it's not a number. So what we're going to do here is we're going to write our if statement. So we're going to say if is NaN. Notice the capitalization there, it's a little bit different. And if is NaN start layer, then we want to alert you must give the script a number, not text. And Make sure we put this inside quotations. Otherwise, we can run our script. Alright, so let's run this, and I'm going to give it some text just to test out what we just created. And you can see it says, you must give the script a number, not text. But if we run it again, and I instead give it a number, you can see it's worked out. So, before I finish this, one last thing I want to go over, and that is, if we run this, and then we hit cancel, you can see we get an error, because even though we pushed cancel, it still went through the entire script after this point. So let's alert what start layer is when we hit cancel. So I'll run this and hit cancel, and you can see it's null. So if you don't put anything in and you just cancel it, start layer is going to come back as null. So right before we run this, we're just going to put one last if statement that says if start layer is not equal to null. So if it's not null, then go ahead and run it. If it is null, that means the user click cancel and they don't actually want to run the script. So let's run this one last time. Hit cancel, and you can see it still alerts null there, and that's because we didn't take away that alert. But you can see we don't get any error, and now our script is running as it should. And this is as complete as we're going to make it. And just so you know, a couple things that we didn't get into. Let's say you run it, and there's 7 markers, but let's say what happens if we start from layer 8? Then we're going to run into an error because we ran out of layers to move. So on your own, maybe you can do another check to make sure that there are enough layers to do this operation, and other checks like that. So there's still many things that we didn't go through in this tutorial, but I hope that what you did learn gives you a pretty solid base of how to get started creating your own scripts. And I hope that you can at least, if nothing else, you can at least see how scripts can help you along in your workflow, how they can speed up some of the things you might do constantly. There are many more things that scripts can do other than just moving layers around. They can do pretty much anything. And if you want to see some examples of the different things that scripts can do, check out aescripts.com, and there are a ton of different scripts to download there. So check it out, research more about scripts. Don't forget about the After Effects scripting guide. That thing is a great reference for scripting, obviously. It's got everything you need to know, tons of different parameters that you can use, different properties. Read through it, start creating your own scripts, and you'll really find some interesting and useful ways to implement them into your workflow. But that's it for this tutorial. Once again, I'm Jesse Tula for BatchFrame.com. I will see you in the next one. Thanks a lot.